the thing I really wanted to know was, how do you explain, okay, you think that God intervened to save you, right? And this all appeals
But
to
he
his
doesn't really think
narcissism.
that. He
I
doesn't
think
really
it,
think that.
I don't know, but I think it really appeals to his narcissism.
Sure.
The idea
Or
that,
maybe
right,
I'm God.
there's a God, and that God is my fan. I love
Yeah.
my fans,
Okay,
right? Like
there you go.
I want I want to meet all my fans.
Okay.
Right?
All right. Now you're speaking my language. That sounds like Donald Trump. Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. Today, I've got with me my old friend, Olivia Nuzzi, Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. Her latest piece is, I examined Donald Trump's ear and his soul. Ew. Well, somebody's got to do it. Hey, Olivia, how are you?
I'm great, I
I
think.
mean, you seem, you were with Donald Trump again. Can you explain to
Yeah.
me why they let you back in to the premises?
It's interesting. This is like the third installment in my features about 2024 where I've interviewed him. The first one was before he had announced that he was running, but he had made up his mind, he told me. And then the next one was about him being sort of cocooned in Mar-a-Lago, with no real campaign to speak of, but he was already technically running. And he really hated that piece.
The Norma Desmond piece. That was the
The
Norma
Norma
Desmond.
Desmond piece. Yeah, he really hated that piece. He called me like dumb as rocks and unattractive and all of these things. But I was confident that he would talk to me again after that. I just knew it would take a little while, and it did take a little while. He's sort of like the eternal optimist in some way. He said something to the effect of like, "Yeah, you've written some mean stories, but let's try it again. What the hell?" And I was like, "Huh, okay."
I hope my mother's not listening because her and Donald Trump are opposite in every way, but they have one trait that's together that maybe I also have a little bit of, I got from her, which is I just always feel like I can win you over.
Yeah, I have that
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if I could just do if I said the one right thing or
Well,
gave
I
you
relate to it because I refuse to have an enemy. Like I
Yeah.
view it as a challenge if someone doesn't like me, and I think that's maybe the one thing that I have in common with him.
And one other just factual matter before we get into the meat of the story. Did you touch his ear? Did you
I didn't
physically
want to
touch it?
touch. I did not touch his
He
ear.
seemed to invite you
Uh,
to, though.
he I don't know. I didn't want to, it was at sort of the beginning of the interview too that this happened. And so, he was showing me from a distance, he was sort of like moving his ear back and forth and showing it to me. And we were seated, maybe 2 or 3 feet apart. And I wear glasses. I'm completely blind without glasses. And so I really needed to come closer to see what he was referring to. And I did not touch it, but I got close enough that I can tell you that he doesn't smell like anything, which is very interesting.
The smell story was false. That is, or maybe it's you. Maybe that's something about your olfactory. I actually have one more thing before we get into the substance of the
Yeah.
story. There's the conspiracies, and I had this just about like what happened with the ear. And like there is a nick you can see in the pictures, and I had this thing how I was in a Decadence, I think. I was in French Quarter. I'm wearing my flip flops, and I have this like tiny cut on one of my toes I didn't notice in my flip flops, and I came home that night. And I was taking off my clothes, I'm in the bathroom, and I wasn't really paying attention. The next morning, I woke up and I had blood all over the sheets, all over the bathroom floor, and it was the tiniest little nick. So I do think that we can get rid of any of the conspiracy mongering. He was nicked. There was
Yeah, I
blood.
mean, I don't have any doubt that something happened to his ear. It seemed, I mean, if I watched the video, a million times while writing this piece, and he seemed so disturbed by what happened. I mean, in a way that he can't fully acknowledge. I think there's no doubt that something happened, and all of the kind of blue and on theories that it was prop blood or whatever people are saying. I don't give any credence to any of that.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to, because you delve deeper into the psyche of Donald Trump than I like to be usually, and maybe that some listeners like to be, so they might not want to go there. So before we get back to that, I
Sorry.
do. Yeah. Hey, it's our reality. We didn't choose it. Before we get to that, I want to, in the context of the debate and like what to expect from him, I did think it was interesting in the piece. You discussed kind of how he has struggled to make this pivot from Biden to Kamala, and how she couldn't come up with a nickname, and and they had the brief phase they tried Kamala. Anyway, so just talk about kind of that conversation and how you see whether he's been able to get his lizard brain around his new foe.
It's interesting. I mean, first of all, he's just very frustrated that he has to do this. He thought that he sort of had it made with Biden as his opponent. Things were going super well in his view, and then he had the rug pulled out from under him. And I think he sees some irony in, he performed so well comparatively at the debate, and the gift that he got in return for that was, maybe losing this election, whereas before he did not think that he was going to. So he's very frustrated by that and feels like it's unfair. But like add that to the list of every other thing that he believes is unfair. But it's interesting. I noticed this in 2020, and I'm sure you did too, that he just could not figure out how to talk about Joe Biden. He didn't really seem to want to talk about Joe Biden. He was talking about Hillary Clinton or even Barack Obama much more than he was talking about Joe Biden. He just wasn't a great villain for him to run against. He didn't animate the base. If you go to rallies or you went to any rallies in 2020, you could tell that people just didn't really care that much about Joe Biden. And so he would sort of see, I think he's very attuned to whether or not the crowd is engaged on something. And he would just pivot to talking about lock her up or talking about Barack Hussein Obama or whatever. And then he finally landed on, some language to talk about Joe Biden and finally got comfortable with it after losing to him in 2020. And now he's got to talk about somebody else who he really doesn't seem to know very much about, Kamala Harris, at all. That was sort of one of the big takeaways for me from our conversations, just basic biographical stuff. He's not really in a defensive posture right now, or at least he wasn't in conversations with me. And so when he was referencing Kamala Harris as being this sort of Marxist, and he was using her father being a Marxist professor in his words, I just conversationally was like, I don't think she even really knew her dad growing up. Like, I think she was raised by her mom. I'm pretty sure she doesn't maintain contact with her dad. And he sort of was like, huh, yeah, maybe that's right. I don't know. And I just thought, like, it's one thing if he's just being shitty and
Sure.
just like misrepresenting her biography to make some sort of political attack. That I sort of expect, right? Or I definitely expect. But for him to genuinely just be sort of spitballing about her and not be sure about whether or not what he's saying is true sort of surprised me. And he seemed sort of surprised by it. Like, yeah, maybe that is wrong. I don't know.
So it's interesting. This was one section I was going to ask you about because there's always some subtext, the Olivia deadpan. I'm kind of wading through, and that same section you talked about how one of his advisors was surprised that he wasn't as attuned to like these Biden interviews back when Biden was trying to save his campaign after the debate. And I just wanted, so is the subtext there? Did you feel like he's losing a step, disengaged? Some
I
signs
think
maybe he
he's,
wasn't as sharp, or like
you
what
know,
were you trying to get at?
the thing that you're referring to, I talked to an advisor. I called someone after that exchange with him, and this followed my meeting with him at Mar-a-Lago and him trying out a new nickname for me, Kamabla. And I genuinely had not heard it. I confess I don't read every Truth Social post, and I didn't know about this nickname. And I really just I was trying to understand what the hell he was saying, and it didn't make any sense to me. And I was like, what is the joke? What is Kamabla? And I think he realized how genuine my confusion was, and he just looked crestfallen about it. And to my knowledge, they haven't really been using the nickname
Mm.
Kamabla since then, so I do sort of take credit for that. But I talked to an advisor after that other exchange about Kamala's father, and I just was sort of like, is he not being briefed? Like, are people not doing sort of the work of getting the principle up to speed that you have to do on a campaign? And this advisor was like, absolutely not. He's not being briefed. And to that effect, he didn't even know that George Stephanopoulos was interviewing Joe Biden after the debate. And he asked me where he could TiVo it. And I thought that was such an interesting story. He's in such a little bunker down there in Mar-a-Lago. And it's sort of like the campaign is in two different modes. It's either he's in the rally mode and he's traveling to these swing states or what have you, or he's being dragged into some court appearance or other, or he's in this living room, this like gilded space where people are sort of coming and kissing the ring and being very respectful and deferential to him. It's not the kind of like hectic, chaotic, people elbowing for proximity environment of campaigns past. And I think that there's probably a lot that, just from a purely political perspective, is like good about that, in that it's not creating insane headlines every day, and he's the only reason why they're off message. Um, but I think, I don't know, I guess people seem a little afraid of him on this
Yeah.
current campaign. That's sort of what I got, and maybe it's preventing them from really doing their jobs.
How does the gilded living room smell?
Different times of year, I've noticed it smells different. I was
Mm,
expecting it to be pretty bad in hurricane season. It wasn't so bad. I've been in there before where it really smells like mildew, and like you
mm,
can just smell all of the old people who have been in that space over
yeah.
the decades. But this time it would just sort of smelled like, an old house.
Hmm. Another thing that you get into, which is I think relevant to the debate tonight, is just that he's kind of annoyed. Like you mentioned, he's annoyed by the situation and he's aggrieved by
Hmm.
the situation, but he also is like annoyed by her a little bit, the attention she's getting, annoyed
Totally.
by the weird thing. So I mean, that isn't great for him. Like we saw at the National Association of Black Journalists, when he's annoyed, that
Yeah.
usually doesn't reflect well on his performance. So I don't like. Do you think that that's persisting, or is he getting over it?
I think the advisors I talked to said like his task has to be to not get irritated by her,
Mhm.
basically. And I know he's received some other advice about sort of just not allowing her to get away with just pithy sound bites, or shivving him rhetorically, to sort of force her to talk in some more depth. But I don't think he really has much ability to not get annoyed by someone. I will say, like, I'm sure that the left, the people have read this
Oh
piece
my God,
probably
wait a
think.
minute. I have two things in common with Donald Trump. This is a horrible podcast. Anyway,
Um,
continue.
I did find that I could tell, sometimes I would formulate a question and I could see him make a decision. I could sort of read it on his face that it was something that he very easily could have gotten very irritated about and responded very defensively, and taken issue with the framing of the question or the way that I said it or whatever, anything that he would typically do in the
Mhm.
past. It used to be the case that it was like dealing with this wild animal and you're trying to waltz with him and not get him so angry that he just thrashes you around, but you're also trying not to let him, walk all over you. This was a much more relaxed Trump, and you could kind of have a semi human conversation with him. And I saw him decide not to take the bait and to take me sort of at face value in wanting answers to my questions. So maybe it's the case that this sort of slower, chiller post-shooting Donald Trump is not going to act like he acted in debates with Hillary Clinton. But I don't know. Then you saw, on last Friday, I was there, he stood in the lobby of Trump Tower for what felt like 4 hours,
Yeah.
talking about every allegation, not even every, I mean, it was probably a fraction of the allegations of some sort of sexual misconduct or sexual assault against him. And he was extremely irritated and he was mad at his lawyers, and it just seemed like, Donald Trump as we've always known him. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think he learned something from the Biden debate, which is, if you keep the focus on your opponent, maybe they reveal themselves in a way that's advantageous to you. But I don't know. Does he learn? I don't know.
Yeah. Can you do it with a black woman next to him? That makes it a little tougher,
I
I
don't
do
know.
think. The I did see there was, and who the hell knows? Like, you just can't even believe anything these people say. But there was a report from Gates and Gabbard and his little debate prep team,
Hmm.
Jason Miller, that they were like, he is going to focus on prosecuting. I don't think they used the prosecuting, but like the record, like the Biden Harris record, and she's going to have to defend the Biden Harris record. And I'm just like, that just doesn't sound like Donald Trump, right? That
No.
he's going to like press her for details on the policy record. Like, that just doesn't sound right to me.
Are you saying he's not a details guy?
I do. I think he is a details guy. On like, I bet he could tell you more about the Hunter Biden laptop from hell than anyone in America, except for like five people. Like ran like tabloid, like
I
details about
don't know.
tabloid gossip, maybe, but like
I,
policy detail, no.
I think with all that stuff, he just sort of gets the gist.
Yeah.
and he moves on. But like I have to tell you, I asked him at one point, I was trying to get him into a conversation about the Hannibal Lecter thing.
Yeah.
And so my way to do that without just jumping right into it was to first ask him about the movie business and to ask him to tell me about what it was like to know Robert Evans.
Yeah.
And he talked about Robert Evans in more detail than he has ever talked to me about anything.
Yeah.
Like I was like, oh, he is a policy expert. If that policy is like old Hollywood filmmaking.
Right.
um, so I don't know. I have a hard time imagining him standing up there, kind of reciting a list of talking points against Kamala Harris, where he knows stuff about her record. I think that's not a Donald Trump that anyone has ever experienced before.
Yeah. I think it's going to be tough for him because he also just absorbs some of that stuff via cable. Like
Yeah.
he had this like in the 2016 like debates, like by the end of them, he had just like this lizard brain ability to kind of just sort of regurgitate stuff that was in his brain because Laura Ingraham had said it, and just like repeat it, and he knew the bad stuff about Hillary and all this
Yeah.
bonus. He hasn't had the time to like let that seep in with Kamala.
It
With
takes him a
Kamala.
while. Like it
Yeah.
really takes him a while. He really didn't know how to. I always thought it was so funny in 2020 and probably part of why he lost that he was at once he was saying that Joe Biden was a criminal mastermind and also that Joe Biden was basically dead. And it was like, well, what is it? Is he Creepy
Right.
Joe or Sleepy Joe? And he couldn't figure it out. And I think that made it difficult for his base and for everyone he was talking to really have a clear idea of what the alternative was that he was presenting. So I don't think he knows enough about Kamala Harris to create a caricature of Kamala Harris that would be appealing to whatever tiny fraction of swing voters he's trying to persuade.
All right, I want to get to the other part of the story. You have a line in there about how Trump and his opponents agree on one thing, that he has not changed after the
Mhm.
assassination, but you make a kind of, I will just say, because we're pals, kind of a dubious implication that you think maybe we might both be wrong, that both Trump and his enemies might be wrong about Trump. So come on, make the case.
I mean, it's not that I think that he is. I think that he is resistant to the reality that if you go through something traumatic as a human being, I think that he has never really thought of himself as part of the human race. Like
Yeah.
I think that he thinks of that as being beneath him. And so therefore you cannot have a human experience or a human reaction
Right.
to an experience if you are not a part of the human race, if you are better than that. And so he's very resistant. And I asked him if he had nightmares, or I didn't ask, I asked, that's what I was asking, but I asked him if he had dreamt about the shooting, for instance. And he knew immediately that what I was asking was, are you fucked up by this?
Right.
And he was absolutely not. Absolutely not. That might happen to some people, some weaker people, he's suggesting, but not to me, Donald Trump. So it's not that I think that he's changed, but he does seem different in conversation. He looks different. He looks a little shell-shocked, frankly. There's no getting around the fact that like I've been interviewing this man for 10 years, almost 10 years exactly. He just asked me where I'm from. Like he he is like making conversation and curious about other people in a way that is frankly alarming. It's like, oh God, like what happened to this guy? Does that mean that his values, a
Sure.
phrase I hate, but that his values are different, or that what motivates him is different? Absolutely not. When I come around to the end of the piece, at the end of the interview, I was sort of just teeing up what was frankly just an easy slam dunk softball question to mix sports metaphors. I don't know anything about sports, obviously.
Yeah.
And I had seen recently his home in Queens that he grew up in, and I was really struck by the fact that I don't know what I was expecting, but it just looked like a house in Queens. Like my mother grew up in Middle Village, Queens. It just looked like a regular Queens house. It looked shockingly small. And I mentioned to him that I'd seen the house, and I said, what do you think when you consider your journey from there to where you are? And I figured he would give me some bullshit like about, oh, well, my mother or my father, or I've accomplished more than anyone on earth.
Yeah.
And instead, he just launched into, he was like, I'm honored by it. I'm honored by it. And I'm waiting for the thing about how amazing he is. And he just launched into this like rant that went on for minutes about how everyone on earth talks about him all the time. And no one has
Sounds
been
familiar.
no one has been talked about as much as Donald Trump is talked about. He was talking in the third person like he always does. He sounded just like Donald Trump as I've encountered him, before the trauma of the shooting. So by the end of the piece, I suppose it's subtle. I
Yeah.
come around to no, he hasn't really changed. But I think that he is traumatized by what happened, and I think that he has no desire and no ability to process it.
Okay, we've got to talk about Donald Trump and God, just because I have to do it since you wrote about it. Here you go. An advisor described his religious curiosity. He has questions about resurrection and eternal life, good and evil, right and wrong, and the afterlife and what happens. How does God decide who lives and doesn't during experiences like that? Who is the fuck? I mean, this fucking advice. Give me a break. And another longtime advisor described his curiosity. He has questions about the resurrection and eternal life, good and evil. No, right? No. No, none of this happened. Donald Trump did not ask any of these people about the resurrection. There was another element in there where you talked about how one of these fuckers talked about how he literally turned the other cheek.
Yeah.
Come
It's
on.
funny. It's like a lot of people are projecting onto him what they wish he would become in the wake of this, right?
Yeah.
And it is true. He is suddenly like asking, like, "Do you believe?" When I asked him a question about God, it was like, "Do you think so?" And it's part of the general curiosity about like, oh, maybe I am part of this human race that people talk about, and I'm interested in the other people who are a part of it all of a sudden. Um, he seems, I mean, I asked him, the thing I really wanted to know was, how do you explain, okay, you think that God intervened to save you, right? And this all appeals
But
to
he
his
doesn't really think
narcissism.
that. He
I
doesn't
think
really
it,
think that.
I don't know, but I think it really appeals to his narcissism. The
Sure.
idea
Or
that,
maybe
right,
I'm God.
there's a God, and that God is my fan. I love
Yeah.
my fans,
Okay,
right? Like
there you go.
I want to meet all my fans. Right?
Okay. All right. Now you're speaking my language. That
there
sounds like
was a
Donald Trump.
there was a line in the piece to that effect that I guess got cut. I haven't looked at the piece. But to him, if he can understand God through the prism of fandom, and God is his fan, and God thinks that he is so important that God stopped everything that God was doing to turn his cheek to look at this stupid fucking chart, right? Then I think he's all in on the God thing. But I asked him, how do you explain a God that would intervene to save you, but not to save the gentleman who was killed, or not to
Corey.
save the two people who were shot and badly injured? And he said, yeah, I've thought about it. And then he launched into this, when he gets uncomfortable, he yammers, right? Like he's just like a grade A yapper. And the yapper yaps to fill the voids so that they don't have to look into it, right? And so it can't stare back. And he was just yapping about how much money he had been able to raise and divert to these families, and praising a friend of his that he alleges gave $1 million check, and talking to me about how much money $1 million is. It doesn't matter how rich you are. He's just yammering and yammering and yammering. And then finally he took a breath, and I was like, okay, but I'm trying to have you thought about it or not? Why would God intervene to save you and not Corey? And then he sort of looked off, and he really did seem to be thinking, which is more than I could say for the Donald Trump of the previous 9 years that I've spoken to. And he said, I don't like to think about it. He went on a whole thing about how he's been really busy, to explain why he hasn't been thinking about it, even though he knows. And he said, I guess I should think about it. And this was another interesting thing about this conversation. He was sort of, he didn't apologize for anything, but he was weirdly willing to accept that he had made mistakes at different times. I asked him, like, why would you have enlisted John Bolton? Why are you relying on advice from Lindsey Graham and all of these neocons if it's so at odds with what you claim is your worldview and your foreign policy? And he gave me this whole like song and dance about how he never really went to Washington before. He'd been there a couple times for his hotel, but he didn't really know anybody, and so he didn't know like who was an idiot and who's not an idiot. But and he made some mistakes as a result of that. But now he's pretty sure that he knows who the idiots are and who he shouldn't trust.
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting that he used the word mistake in relation to himself, which is not something that I've ever known him to do. I mean, the bar is low.
The
The
bar is
bar
really
is
low.
really, really low. The bar can't get any lower.
I thought it was
really.
just interesting. The one last thing on the God thing was, yeah, when in a different part you're talking to him about it, and he like starts to do he starts to play pretend about how
Yeah.
he thinks that God really intervened, and then you're like, then he like downgrades himself to talking about how other people are
Yeah, he
talking
can't
about
do
how
it.
he just can't
Can't do
do it.
it. And I
Right.
mean, even in another point when he's talking about God. He's talking about God, and then he immediately is like, "You see that photo? Oh, did you see that really good photo?" And then he's like, "Were there any other really good photos that day? Why was that photo iconic? Do you have any theories?" Like,
Yeah.
and he wanted me and Isabel Browerman, who was painting his portrait during this interview, to assess aesthetically these photographs and why some of them broke through and some of them did not. And it was like that conversation started with me asking him about God, and it ended with him being like, "Yeah, these photos are really amazing." But
Yeah.
it all reminded me of there's this wonderful story. I think it was actually two stories, but this profile of Lee Atwater by Marjorie Williams, who used to write for Vanity Fair, and
Yeah.
she's dead now, but she's like one of the all-time great feature writers and someone I admire so much. And at the end of his life, Lee Atwater claimed to
Yeah.
have found God.
I've
He
read
had,
this.
he'd found God, and I might be bungling this, but in my memory, the story is that she goes and visits him, or she relays that someone that she was speaking to for this story goes and visits him on his deathbed, and there's like a stack of Bibles, and they're all still covered in plastic. Right? There's always a bit of that
Yeah.
with Donald Trump.
Is the portrait? Did you get a peek at it? Is like an update of the golf portrait of him in the white
The
vest,
portrait
or
we ran the portrait alongside the story in the magazine,
I'm on the app. I missed it in the app. It must not
and
have appeared in the app version.
and it's really something. I wrote the piece with the portrait like looming over me
Mm.
in Isabel's apartment, and I think it affected the kind of surrealistic aspect of the piece, perhaps.
That is dark. Well, you always make me like, just reconsider is not the right word. Think again about Donald, like just kind of like look at askance at Donald Trump from a slightly different vantage point than I always have looking at him, which is a deep challenge considering how much time I spend thinking about this asshole. So that is to your great credit. Last thing, any predictions? We're in prediction business. The people listening to this have 5 hours till the debate, so they're nervous.
Yeah,
Their stomachs are nuts. Is there anything that
I
you want to
don't.
leave them with for tonight?
I'm not really good at
Me
predictions.
neither.
Um,
Any advice to them for their anxieties? Any
to the
cocktails?
candidates?
No, to the
Oh,
listeners. To
it's
the
like, what the fuck
listeners.
do I? What the
The
fuck do
listeners
I
right
care
now.
about?
You're their therapy right now. They're like this
Oh,
debate is coming.
yeah.
I'm breathing into a paper bag.
Yeah, yeah, you're
Any
in real
thoughts?
trouble if anyone's relying on me for therapy. I feel like yes, it might matter. I know I keep having this debate with people I know, right? Where
Mm,
it's like, does anything that happened in these debates, leaving aside the last debate where it really mattered, does anything that happens now really matter? And I kind of think it does. I think like when we're talking about that tiny fraction of voters who will decide the election, I think a lot of those people are people who are going to vote pretty emotionally
yeah.
and are going to make a decision based on one or two things that they see where they say, "Oh, I can't vote for that person," or "Oh, I guess I could vote for that person."
Yeah.
So I think it really does matter as surface level as it all feels. um but no, do I have any advice? Don't do a drinking game. I think that's a bad idea. People always tell me they do that for debates, and I can't understand why you'd want to
Horrible.
take a
Yeah,
downer
don't do a drinking game. I always
during a
think back to
downer.
election night 2016. I saw the tweet that was after Trump won Florida that was like, things are getting so real, I've stopped drinking. That's how I feel about the about the debate. It's too real. It's too real for alcohol. Olivia Nuzzi, thank you as always. We'll be talking to you soon. I hope to see you out on the trail.
Thank you so much.